Hands up, get your hands up, show me your hands, show me your hands! Do not move, reach for that gun and I will shoot you! Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video we're going to talk about why you should have a weapon-mounted light on your handgun. Right off the bat, bold statement. I'm saying you should, meaning it should be mandatory. It should not be optional. It should not be a luxury. My main reasoning behind this is the fact that you don't really lose a lot, really anything super inconvenient by adding a weapon-mounted light to your handgun, be it your home defense gun or your carry gun. And the gains are significant. However, there's still a portion of the shooting population that believes that a handheld light only is going to be sufficient, or because they have night sights and their future predicting abilities, their clairvoyant nature, is going to prevent them from finding themselves in situations of low light because they don't normally go out at night. Or they don't ever enter into buildings where darkness can be a problem. And I mean, you know, darkness being total lack of light or very low light situations, and where positive identification of a threat would be complicated by the lack of light. Even though they could see a person, they couldn't necessarily positively identify that person, such as, I don't know, their daughter coming home late from sneaking out, or their wife, or their husband, or their children. I kind of already prefaced the children thing. Or just a drunk guy who thought it was his apartment or his house. Positive identification is part of shooting. In fact, it's part of one of the cardinal rules. Be aware of your target or threat, depending on which terminology you want to use, and of course what is beyond it. It tends to be the rule that we are the most tone deaf to in shooting because the nature in which we practice is very artificial. Force-on-force training is not nearly as common as it should be, and generally ranges where you go to practice on your own, if you don't take formal training classes, do not really provide the facilities necessary to practice in even a remotely realistic fashion. So people are left with the false confidence in the fact that what they have is going to work because it works well in the environment they practice in. And if you only have practice under best case scenario, best case conditions, best case lighting, you may find yourself being a little clairvoyant to assume that the situations you find yourself needing to defend yourself in are going to be just like that. Something we definitely have to get out of the way, a sacred cow or a misbelief or a common misconception that needs to be killed immediately, is the fact that low light training is somehow considered to be advanced. If you're able to shoot under low light conditions, or training under low light conditions, or practicing under low light conditions, is somehow this advanced skill, and that's absolutely 100% completely false. What gives it that appeal, or I should say that impression, is the fact that low light practice is harder to come by than typical reasonable lighting situations. Most indoor ranges, not really going to let you kill the lights to shoot under low light conditions. And most low light ranges, where you are able to shoot low light, don't accurately reflect the majority of the low light situations a person could find themselves in. I've taken low light courses before where the range, if no one turned on a light, you literally couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face, which isn't very realistic if you think about it. If it's that dark, and my bad guy's not wearing NVGs, I'm unlikely to find myself in a self-defense situation. Doesn't mean it's impossible, it just means it's highly unlikely unless the bad guy, like I said, has night vision or a light source of his own. That doesn't mean that those lighting situations can't exist within environments where there's multiple different lighting situations present. You go into any parking garage or any dimly lit building, any home with the lights turned off or only some of the lights turned off, and you're likely to find multiple different lighting conditions within a small proximity of square footage. But low light training shouldn't be advanced. It shouldn't be considered to be advanced. Low light practice should be common because darkness is a constant, whereas sunlight is occasional. We have daylight. You know, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, it's up and it's down, and it's available for that period of time, whereas darkness can exist 24/7 depending on the environment you find yourself in. If you look at statistics, and of course statistics can tell the story, they may be correlation versus causation, but if you look at law enforcement, I use law enforcement as an example, one for the law enforcement officers that are watching this video, because probably your department is deficient and out of legal requirements for low light training and practice. But I mention law enforcement because they're reliable statistics. Most law enforcement shootings happen in low light situations. When I say most, if you look at the average for like FBI's LEOCA, or Officer Down Memorial page, you look at where, you know, time of day, time of the incident, time of night, time of the incident, you'll find that low light is a more common time for shootings to occur. Now that doesn't mean that the situation was no light. It just means it happened in diminished lighting, and of course that lighting is going to vary greatly from situation to situation. But the fact remains that humans are diurnal by nature. We are daytime predators, which means in low light situations we do not see well. We cannot necessarily get positive identification of what we're trying to protect ourselves from. And because the human mind usually makes assumptions based on safety, what may appear initially to be a threat may actually turn out to be, I don't know, your teenage daughter sneaking back in. Now somebody watching this video can lament, well, I don't have the opportunity or the ability to practice under low light. I'm not able to. I disagree to an extent. One, if you don't have a range where you can fire live ammunition in low or no light settings, you can take a low or no light class where an instructor is present to teach you the proper techniques. One of the commonalities that I see in firearms, especially with people who are very pedestrian in their approach to training, is they have these misconceptions about what low light is and what kind of low light tools that they should have. I see a lot of guys buy a decent gun and then they skimp on what light they put on it. And then they talk about things like, oh, you don't want more than 200 or 300 lumens, which is plainly false from anybody who's ever taken a low light course, especially a structure course, a shoot house course. You know that 200 or 300 lumens isn't really cutting it. And if you've taken a force on force class, you know 200 or 300 lumens is not going to give you the positive identification and the control you want in a more realistic low light setting. So those beliefs are going to continue to be pervasive and continue to be spread and replicate and become memonic, if you will, because there's only a small portion of the shooting community that's actually going out there and taking these courses. And of course the argument can be made, well, you know, it's my right to have a firearm. And you're absolutely correct. It's your responsibility to not shoot the wrong fucking people. Is mistake of fact an epidemic? No, it's not. Even in law enforcement, mistake of fact shootings are rare when you compare them to how many justified shootings law enforcement have. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of what qualifies as a justified shooting. Suffice it to say, the shootings I'm referring to were investigated and deemed to be justified, and many of them have accompanying videos where anybody watching it as a reasonable person would be like, yeah, I probably would have shot that person too if I was in that same situation. What I'm talking about is the concept behind odds versus stakes. What are the odds I'm going to be in a self-defense shooting? They're actually pretty low. You're probably more likely to encounter a car wreck where you could render medical aid than you are to find someone under threat where you could defend them, a third-party defense situation. However, we carry firearms because we're prepared to take responsibility for our own life and the life of anyone we choose to protect. And because that's a responsibility we're taking on ourselves, it's not a responsibility we have to take on. We don't have to carry a gun. It's a right, but it's not necessarily a requirement of being an American. That's the greatest thing about it, is free choice. I don't have to carry a firearm even though I have rights, recognized natural rights by the Constitution that says, yes, I can carry this gun because this Constitution is recognizing the natural right to self-defense. Self-defense is precognitive. It's programmed into our neurology. We react, and the firearm is just the best tool to do that. That being said, what's the excuse for not making sure that you're best prepared for a self-defense situation by making sure that you're able to get the data you need by adding a weapon-mounted light to your handgun? Hopefully I didn't lose anybody, and there might be a few people thinking, man, we took a really weird road to get back to where we started. I'm talking mainly about the responsibility of shooting the right threats in the event that you need to engage a threat. Not only does the light allow me to positively identify my threat, it allows me to control that threat and maybe in that last quarter of a second of engagement prevent the need for me to have to use my firearm, because light is an excellent tool to remove a threat's visual horizon, remove the data they're taking in, and put them at a significant enough disadvantage that they may just surrender and no shots need to be fired, which is advantageous. Now, if the need for violence is there, by all means, be violent. Protect your life, protect the life of anybody you're choosing to protect in that situation. But make sure you're doing it with the most amount of knowledge you can get out of a situation, which is going to be granted by using a weapon-mounted light. The most common excuse, and I'm going to call it just straight up excuse, that I hear for not using a weapon-mounted light is, well, you know, it's going to create a more bulky situation. Okay, maybe. However, people compromise all over the place when it comes to guns because of comfort. A gun should, and it's said, and it's a cliche, that a gun should be comforting, not comfortable, which I agree with to a certain extent. But if you carry appendix and you sit in a car for 3 hours and you're carrying a full-size 17 with a comp on it, you kind of start to wonder, maybe I should have grabbed that 19 or that 43 or that 26 or that Smith & Wesson Shield out of the safe instead of this big old hog leg, which I definitely can appreciate. Guys that hip carry can have the same problem. Our life kind of dictates how much gun we're able to comfortably carry and comfortably conceal. Now that being said, my everyday carry right now is a 19X with an X300U Surefire. This is carried in the appendix. I sit, I stand, I teach. I get on the ground, I roll around, I do whatever I need to do with this gun. Now that's by my body type. This might not be a light that you're able to get away with based on your frame, based on your occupation, what have you. Totally get it. Maybe you carry a gun so small that, well, it doesn't have a light rail. There's also no excuse there. Here's a Glock 43 and it's got a TLR 6 on it. Now this is not a good light as far as output is concerned. Performance is very, very anemic. However, at reasonable self-defense distances, I may not be able to control a threat beyond 5, 7, 10 meters depending on the lighting environment I'm in, but I can certainly positively identify them and figure out if I do in fact need to be pointing a gun at that person. Don't get me wrong, handheld lights are great and they are a necessity, just like I consider the weapon light to be at this point. If you've watched my videos for a few years, going back 4 or 5 years, I've talked in the past how a handheld light is a mandatory and a weapon light is optional but highly recommended. I'm at the point now where I consider both of them to be mandatory. There's the old trope of, oh, they're going to shoot at the light. Okay, yeah, maybe. However, if the situation takes place in daylight like this, they're just going to shoot at me. At low light situations, they shoot at what I allow them to see. And if I'm using proper light and I've got a significant amount of candela and lumen output from that light, I'm probably removing from them their ability to accurately see what they're trying to hit. You would, those of you who've taken low light courses, especially force on force classes, know exactly what I'm talking about. Regardless of the ambient lighting and photonic barriers that are present, if you're pushing a lot of horsepower out of your light, the bad guys can't really hit you as well as movies and people's misinformation and misbeliefs would have you believe. Now some people may make this statement like, well, okay, but I already carry a weapon mounted light, I carry a really good light, I carry Surefire, I carry a Streamlight HLX, I carry a whatever you're carrying, an O-Light or whatever 4.7s or other brands that are out there that put out, you know, high output lights. Why would I need a weapon mounted light? Well, how often do you shoot with your handheld light and how well do you shoot when you do it? Chances are your accuracy suffers greatly when you use your handheld light because barring some sort of additional device added to the flashlight body, such as my carry light has a theorem switchback on it that allows me to actually use a proper two-handed grip, or close to a proper two-handed grip. Chances are, if you're using a Harry's method or an FBI or a neck index or chin index or whatever technique you're using, your grip is probably significantly compromised to really non-existent. Of the classic grip techniques, the Harry's is one of the ones that's considered to be the most stable. However, if you think about what's actually going on with the mating of the two hands, back of hand to back of hand, that's not actually a grip. If anything, it's a little added stability and maybe a quicker recovery from recoil. If your one-handed shooting is already not very good, it's probably going to suffer even more when you start to factor a light into it. One thing I see in force on force and live fire courses is guys that run handheld lights only, when they run things solo after that first or second round, their hot spot is no longer on their target, it's on the ground, it's up in the air, it's off the left, it's off to the right, because their grip just becomes compromised and they're constantly having to make readjustments, which shows down their cadence and significantly affects their ability to get accurate hits. I think we hit all the salient points of argument in regards to this topic. If you hold some of these beliefs in your head and you have not taken a low light course, the question I have for you is, are you willing to admit the fact that there are things that you do not know? And I admit this to myself anytime I'm looking at a situation in which I'm trying to augment or adjust what I teach or what I personally practice. Is there something about this subject I don't know? If you're honest with yourself, you can be watching this video and say, yeah, there's plenty of things I don't know. Okay, so we've gotten to that point. If you're willing to admit there's things you don't know, here's the harder question. Are you willing to admit that there's things that you believe now that may be wrong? That's a much harder question to be honest about, because we generally do not like to be wrong. And it's generally a situation where, and you see this on the internet the most, because the internet is the worst possible place to have a debate about anything, because people have the comfortability of not being face-to-face and being able to check out of the conversation anytime they want to. They don't have the same, I guess, requirements to maintain a certain degree of civility over the topic as they would in person. So if you're willing to admit there's things that you may believe now that you're wrong, and I've literally made a video about this, about things I used to believe that I no longer believe, so I'm definitely not putting myself on some kind of ivory tower or high horse. There are things that I probably believe now that will adjust in the future based on lessons learned or just more experience. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm still not an expert. I'm a sufficiently talented enthusiastic amateur if we really want to get into it. But I'm willing to admit to myself, and I should probably admit it to myself more often depending on the topic, depending on the conversation, there are things I believe that might be wrong. This is not one of them. And the reason I can say that is because I've looked at this topic from every single angle I could possibly approach it from. I've talked to my peers, I've talked to other instructors, I've asked students their opinions, I've gotten a large sample size of information, and I cannot find any prevailing reason why there is no reason to not have a weapon-mounted light on your firearm. And you may think, well, this is very, very gear-focused, and you're absolutely right, it is. However, it goes back to my thing of saying, low-light training it's not an advanced skill. Low-light skills are not advanced skills. They're just skills. They're the same skills you use in the daylight, slightly more complicated depending on what lighting source you're using in low-light, but the same rules, the same penalties definitely apply. And if anything, I think the penalty for bad technique and bad technology at light, under low-light conditions, is a little bit more severe. So if you're still with me, and you've admitted the fact that you could be wrong, and you admitted the fact that there are things that you may not know, and those two may go hand in hand. There's a big difference between ignorance and stupidity. Ignorance is fine. There's such a thing as willful stupidity, though. You realize, or willful ignorance is another way to put it. I realize I need to know something and I choose not to learn it anyway. Negligent incompetence is another way to put that. There's a bunch of different terminologies for it. There's even some legal terminology for it in tort law if you're interested in looking that up. So if we're willing to admit those two things, then consider the possibility that maybe what you're doing now isn't the best practice for your self-defense approach. Maybe the gun you're carrying, even though it doesn't have a light rail and you can't put a U-boat on it or a TLR or whatever, there's a light out there that'll fit on it. And it's not the best light. I can guarantee you right now that the lights available for guns that don't have light rails are anemic. But they're definitely higher output than rail-mounted lights were 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we got by okay then. That being said, I want the technology to improve. I'd love to have a light on a Glock 43 that put out 1,000 lumens. And someday we may get that, especially with battery technology getting away from the 123s, we might get that. But for now, any light is going to be better than no light. And your night sights, I don't really see how night sights help you positively identify a target in an environment where you can't see the sights well enough without glowing tritium vials or iridium or some other glowing phosphorescent, luminescent paint and or whatever. Of course, there's caveats to every rule. You could find yourself in a situation where you're in the darkness, but the target's in the light. Again, the sights are going to be backlit by the light because the target's, yeah, well. Take your night sight gun and work it around your house without a light on. And see how well that works out for you. Chances are you'll be like, okay, the night sights are cool, but I just put a weapon light on it, now I can see much better, and now my night sights don't do what they do. They're still very helpful for finding your gun in the dark, I'll give you that. So, consider those two questions. Is there things I don't know, and could my beliefs currently be wrong? That's my approach to this. If you have a prevailing reason for why you cannot factually put a weapon-mounted light on your handgun, feel free to drop them in the comments section because I'm very curious to see what people's explanations are. I'm not saying it's not possible because I still have to answer those two questions myself. Are there things I don't know and could I be wrong? However, I took a lot of different approaches to this, a lot of different questions, a lot of conversations before I decided to make this video. That being said, find something, find a weapon-mounted light because a weapon-mounted light is going to allow you to be two-hand control on the gun. And it's going to give you that positive identification you need to avoid shooting the wrong person in the event that you have a questionable low-light encounter, be it in your home or outside of the home. I'm Aaron Cowan with Stage Dynamics. Train accordingly.
What's your address, sir?
5960 East 4 Mile Road. Hey, let's hang up that phone, bro. Put that gun down. Oh, hey.